And as KXEL Live and Local continues on this Wednesday, January 15th, we have made connection via Zoom with Michael Swanger. Mr. Swanger is the publisher and editor of Iowa History Journal. The new first issue of Volume 17 is out, January-February issue, with two very familiar faces on the cover. We'll get to those ladies in a moment. Mr. Swanger, Happy New Year, and thanks for taking the time.
Happy New Year to you and your listeners as well, Jeff. Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me back on your show.
17 years, 17 volumes now of this publication, and you've been in charge for more than half of that. Boy, the years just go, don't they?
They do. Our mutual friend, as you know, Mike Chapman, founded the magazine in 2009 and trusted me to take good care of his baby. And 12 years later, I've been at the helm, and it's amazing to think that I've owned it for more than twice as long as Mike had it. And I can't believe that we're in our 17th year either, Jeff. They really are kind of flying by. I mean, I guess there's some truth to the old adage that when you're having fun, time flies by. And it's really been fun, and it's been just a lifelong goal and pleasure to publish a magazine like this.
Well, it is more popular than ever, growing by leaps and bounds based upon where you can find it in the stores, subscriptions, etc. We'll tip people off again on where to find it in the stores, but if you'd like to subscribe, and why wouldn't you, go to iowahistoryjournal.com. That's the best way to make sure you don't miss an issue. And one thing about you is that you're not afraid to make the individuals who work for the magazine do double duty. This is now 2 issues in a row when you're making Arvid Huseman, who thought he was retired, do not only a column, which is spot on as always, about life in Iowa, but he has the cover story this time. Tell me about these young ladies I see on the cover.
I will, and not only Arvid, but yourself as well. I think both of you probably feel like you can't get away from me fast enough. So, no, we're talking about the preeminent newspaper advice columnists in the U.S. during the second half of the 20th century, Ann Landers and Dear Abby, whose real names, they were twin sisters. Their real names are Esther Pauline Friedman, who wrote Ann Landers, and Pauline Esther Friedman, who wrote Dear Abby. So try not getting those two first names mixed up between those two twin sisters. It's only taken me about a dozen times to reread the story to make sure I have them straight. But we are talking about, really, when you think about the history of newspapers, I can't imagine anyone who's been read more, really, to be honest with you, Jeff, especially in the modern era of newspapering, because we're talking about tens of millions of readers in thousands of newspapers across the U.S. At one point, the Ann Landers column, which was written by Esther, was reportedly had 90 million readers in 1,200 newspapers. Dear Abby, conversely, was published in 1,400 newspapers with readership of 110 million. I dare you to find anyone who had that kind of pull in terms of the newspaper business and that kind of loyalty of readership over the years. It's just astounding to me.
And again, for decades and decades, we just talked about 17 years of your publication. You're talking almost a half century of cranking out. And that was at the time when you were cranking out columns 6 and 7 a week. I mean, that was expected. There was none of this 3-day-a-week sort of thing. I mean, the volume necessary is just amazing.
It is, and it's incredible. Arvid did just a wonderful job. Well, first of all, let me back up to say that, as you know, and your listeners have heard us talk about this, I try to find what I feel to be the best writer for certain stories. Now, I'm blessed to have a stable of talented writers who can write about many things, yourself included. And Arvid is among that group as well. But Arvid, as you know, has been a long time columnist for IHJ, and he was a former newspaper man. So I thought, who best to write it other than Arvid? And he seemed to have some very good insights about what it takes to be a columnist. And he shares some of that throughout his research of the twin sisters. But they were certainly prolific, as we were talking about. And I don't know if anyone could have seen that coming from the two of them when they were born on July 4th in 1918 in Sioux City. And Arvid knows that area well because he spent some time working in the newspaper business over there. The long story short, for those who don't know their backstory, is that in 1955, Esther, who wrote Ann Landers, she was known by her friends in Sioux City as Eppie, and then she became the Chicago Sun-Times' new Ann Landers, taking over the writing duties of the previous Ann Landers who had recently died. And then several months later, Pauline, better known to her Sioux City friends as Popo, became the author of the popular newspaper advice column Dear Abby. Of course, she took on a new pseudonym and later on it called herself Abby Van Buren, but Abigail Van Buren. But the two were inseparable during their time growing up in Sioux City, so much to the point that not only they graduated from high school there in Sioux City, they graduated from Morningside College in Sioux City, wrote columns for their newspapers in school. They they were even married in a double wedding ceremony on July 2nd, 1939. So the twins had never been separated until their wedding night. And then once their careers began, then obviously they were living in different cities, one in Chicago, one in San Francisco, and then their lives kind of separated. But they always had this incredible bond from their time in Sioux City that even during a 10-year spat where they didn't get along as well, they still maintained that. And then later on, when they kind of reunited later on and kind of got over some things, they always came back and visited Sioux City, never forgot their Sioux City roots. So that's kind of like the backstory about their Iowa connection.
What I find just tremendous as well, they are first-generation Americans. Their parents had emigrated to this country 10 years before they were born, and they were born on Independence Day. And to then go forward and be such a fabric, part of the fabric of American life throughout the 20th century, it's just a story that, frankly, if you had been an editor of a magazine and someone presented this to you and you didn't know any better, you'd say, well, that's too fanciful. Nobody's going to buy this story. This can't really happen. That's what makes so many of these stories, and again, with Arvid's tremendous writing, they're just really gems because there's been just enough distance. Those of us with plenty of gray in our respective beards can remember these folks. A lot of the readers may not have known the story or known the full backstory. And so it's a wonderful thing to present here.
It's like so many stories, too. And in particular, I'm glad you pointed out that their parents were immigrants because, as you know, as we all know, it seems like folks who immigrated here hit the ground running, trying to work, make their way in life. And they seem to be extra driven and motivated. And certainly, when you get to know the story of these two amazing women, they did not lack in motivation. They were driven women. They were very career oriented. They wanted to be at the top of their games, and they would work night and day to be there, to become that. And in the story, Arvid has just great examples of how hard they worked, how late they worked, and also he would talk about their failures and their successes. But one of the more touching things that I liked about the story was that when they were receiving thousands of letters per week, and at one point, Dear Abby reportedly was getting 7,000 letters a week, and obviously they had to have staff members to help them sort through all the mail. They would get letters from readers who were despondent about serious issues in their life, including those who were, frankly, who were suicidal. They would take the time out of their incredibly busy schedule to call these people personally, to check in on them and give them guidance and tell them where they need to go to seek help, whether it's, therapeutic advice or medical advice, et cetera. I don't, over all the years of seeing those columns in the newspaper, sometimes you glance at them and you think some of the subject matter is a bit trivial. And then there's something that's very serious in there as well. We all know that from having read them over the years, but I had no idea really kind of the depth of their humanity until Arvid wrote this story, because not only did they take the time to do things like that, but they were also instrumental in helping fund programs that just kind of, help people's lives. Again, I think all that is kind of lost to history, and I don't know how many people knew that about them.
The cover story in the current issue of Iowa History Journal, Ann Landers and Dear Abby, America's top advice columnists, were Friedman twin sisters from Sioux City. The author, Arvid Huseman, the publisher and owner of the magazine, is Michael Swanger, and he joins us on News Talk 1540 KXEL. And in an era where, and again, they were predominantly print. One of them did do some radio, etc. But you think of where we are today with various advice shows, call-in shows on the radio, on television, etc. I mean, this was the foundation for those next ideations that came generations later.
You're right, and I think to their credit, looking back at their work, they have very progressive views. But in terms of their own lives, they led a very traditional, very conservative, moral lives that would also come through in their writing. And unlike some of the folks who may have used their work as a blueprint in other mediums, I feel when you compare them to some of the things that are online, especially or on TV today, they seem quite grounded and very practical and very reasonable. And so, in that regard, I think their influence was wide, not only across the newspaper business, but as you mentioned, other advice shows too, whether it was on TV or on radio. They really did set the bar high for a lot of generations of journalists to follow.
IowaHistoryJournal.com is where you can go to easily subscribe. You can also pick this up on the newsstand, as we used to say. You've got me back in the old days with the boys on the street hawking newspapers here. Where might we be able to? We can go to IowaHistoryJournal.com for the full list, but an example of many of the places where we could pick up the second and third copies of the magazine on the newsstand.
That's a great idea, Jeff. You can get them at all of the Barnes & Noble stores in Iowa, many of the Hy-Vee stores. We are also sold at select Walmart, Mills Fleet Farm, Books A Million stores. There is a list of all the retail outlets on our website, and you can easily find one in your town just by visiting IowaHistoryJournal.com.
And I alluded to the fact that you're a slave driver, and so therefore here's Arvid Huseman trying to enjoy his retirement, but oh no, double duty again. Swanger says do a column and a major article, but the column is just pure Arvid. I mean, it's something that, and again, he does this so well, I have to say, and I'm jealous of that, but there are so many oddities about our wonderful state, and you want to try to convey them in some way. And he's done it so well here. Tell us more.
Well, he finds a fun way to weave together. It's kind of like the name game. We've ran a column in the past called What's in a Name? It'll be about the history of a town. He kind of has done this with this column, and it's about, for instance, all the cities in Iowa whose name involves a lake: Okoboji, Spirit, Clear, Carter, dozens more. Or maybe it's a pronunciation of a town or even a county. And then he'll compare how the locals pronounce it versus how the rest of us pronounce it and the differences there. So he has written about this in the past. He'll get into the minutia of the regional dialect, if you will, of Iowa and its counties. And I love it because it's unique. It's something that you don't always find out there, especially in printed publications. So yeah, he has a wonderful touch for that. When you read Arvid's columns, you're not only entertained, you're informed, but you also get the sense that he is just woven into the fabric of this state, and everything that he writes just has that feel about it.
A couple of things from this, and I know we do it around these parts, but there's Webster City. Well, if you're from Webster City, you might say you're going to Webster. Well, that's good, except there is a town named Webster. And the same thing where there's Buffalo Center, but don't just tell somebody to meet you in Buffalo because there is a Buffalo, Iowa. And don't even get us started with the fact that Iowa City is not in Iowa County, et cetera, et cetera. So those are a couple of the things. Well, we talked about, and you made this observation as we were connecting today. So you've talked about Dear Abby and Ann Landers, focused on the print world. Your column, The Publisher's Perspective, focuses on a legendary radio figure from Iowa who left us not long ago.
Yeah, we're talking about another, I guess I could call him a friend from afar, and certainly you could, the legendary sportscaster Al McCoy. Now, this is obviously not news to you or your listeners because Al sadly died on September 21st last year at age 91. Well, at the time of his death, we were just putting together, we were getting ready to go to press with our November, December issues. So I didn't have the time or the space to get something in. And I just would be remiss if I didn't talk about Al in my column for the first issue of the new year because he's just an incredible legend, as you know. And he grew up in Williams on a farm, and during the 30s and 40s, he would practice his broadcasting skills. Excuse me, for an audience of the family's pigs and cattle, and he parlayed all that.
Sometimes that's more than I have, I got to tell you.
Well,
So,
listen, I understand. So, it's but he had an amazing career, and he was known as the voice of the Phoenix Suns. He's in the Hall of Fame. He was a play-by-play announcer for the Phoenix Suns from 72 to 2023. So 51 years. He was revered by fans and players and coaches. And he came up with all these just unique catchphrases like Shazam. I know you've talked about him quite a bit on your show, which was just a great call for a three-pointer, or whammo for a slam dunk, or he would say zingo the strings for a made basket, in particular a swish. And he was just an NBA broadcasting legend, and no one has done it longer than Al. And as you know from having talked to him and knowing his story, what a just gracious gentleman he was. He was truly kind of Iowa nice throughout his life. And on a personal note, even though I never got to speak to him directly or meet him, which I would have loved to have had the opportunity, he was also a longtime subscriber to IHJ. And whenever he would send in his renewal notice to me, he would just write a nice note of encouragement to me, or occasionally he would contribute a letter to the editor. And it was just fun for me to get because, someone of his stature doesn't have to take the time to do that. And he loved Iowa so much, and he never forgot his roots. And he loved what we did. He felt he was always encouraging about the work that we were doing of trying to preserve Iowa's history. So what a great Iowan. The least I could do is pay tribute to him in my column.
he would come back every year, at least until the last few years, to visit Williams, Iowa. And he started at the radio station in Webster City, which is now KQWC. It had a different name at the time, but he'd stop by there. He would encourage those younger broadcasters there because, again, what an example. But notice, it is tragic that he passed away. He was 91, first of all, and he had only been retired from NBA broadcasting for a year. I mean, this is phenomenal. I mean, the life and the career, and he wrote an autobiography called The Real McCoy. We have a few copies left at totallyiowa.com, I should note, because people have asked when we've mentioned his passing a few months ago. But again, just a real genuine individual. And yes. I'll tell one brief story as you did. I emailed him about something some years ago, and I didn't hear back, which that's fine, right? Busy man. About a week later, I get this apologetic email because he said they had gone on a road trip and he had forgotten his phone in the car at the airport. Oh, and apparently that's how he was getting messages, etc. And so it's like, sorry, I just got my phone after a week. And I'm thinking he probably felt relieved to not have the burden of the phone. And you and I would be just panicked, making the plane turn around to go get the phone. Al McCoy, the late sportscaster from Iowa, the publisher's perspective topic in this edition of Iowa History Journal. And you were kind enough to invite me to cover television. So we had print, we've had radio, and now television is gracing the pages again on a story that begins on page 8. And we've already told you there was a missed opportunity, but I'll just let it go.
That's very gracious of you. Thank you. I'm sorry I did not start the story on page 5. Had I been as clever as you and as thoughtful as you, I would have made an attempt to do that for you.
And notice, I said I was going to let it go by apparently bringing it up. That's not really letting it go, is it? But what is this story about?
Well, it's about Local 5 at 75. It's about historic WOI-TV marking its diamond anniversary this year. It's amazing to think that the second ever television station in Iowa, the 100th television station in the U.S., took to the air on February 21st, 1950, according to its author, Jeff Stein. And I hear that he knows quite a bit about the history of television and radio and other mediums. So I'm just taking his word for it. Maybe you can fill in the rest here, and maybe this is just where I sign off. And before I do, let me
Yes.
just go back and revisit this comment too.
Yes.
The Real McCoy is a terrific read. It's actually one of the first books that I read when I bought the magazine in terms of an Iowa bio. So I wanted to mention that to your listeners. So this is not me plugging the book for Jeff or Jeff plugging, that kind of thing. It really is a good read, and I would encourage folks to go to totallyiowa.com to get a copy. Now back to WOI TV.
Yes.
When you pitched the story to me about a year ago, I had no idea that they were coming up on their diamond anniversary. And that's when one of the things that you and I have talked about is we try to be as timely as possible because to most people, you might think, well, what's timely about history? Well, there are a lot of lessons to be learned and a lot of things get repeated. And this is a great example of the timeliness of that. And I couldn't think of anyone better to write it. And I'm so glad that you take our readers on a exciting journey about how the TV station was founded, what it went through in its early days, and all the things that we take for granted now that we see when we watch Channel 5 weren't so easy to come about because of all the hard work from folks who laid the foundation there.
Folks who grew up in central Iowa for certain would know many of the names and the faces. Again, this is the ABC affiliate based in Des Moines, but as you noted, only the second station on the air in Iowa, just a few months after the folks in Davenport put what is now Channel 6 on the air. And one of the things that I don't believe I mentioned in the piece, but you did a story, your magazine did a story a few years ago on the project at Ames during World War II with regard to the atomic bomb. And the university received money from the federal government to conduct the research. And a portion of that money was used to put up a tower that was used for WOI FM and then TV. And
wow.
And the thing that was kind of interesting about the timing is the folks at Iowa State, then Iowa State College, had the license to put the TV station on the air, but they hadn't budgeted any money for it. You know, they hurried and put the application in, which was great. And so they didn't have the resources. And then all of a sudden came this windfall, if you will, from the federal government. And that let them lift the FM on the air. And a few months later, here comes television. So budgeting then and now important.
Careful what you wish for.
That's it. Exactly. Yeah. Here comes TV. One of the things that is unique about this station is the fact that it was tied for many years to the university. That's not common. Usually they're commercial endeavors, and it certainly is commercial now. But that's one of the things that probably made this more unique than some of the other stations.
Absolutely. And you do a good job of explaining this to the readers because I was not aware of this. I mean, I knew that it was founded at Iowa State. I knew that it began as an educational endeavor, but I didn't think about, as I'm sure a lot of readers did not, in terms of the kind of transition it had to make to balance being an educational station, but yet competing with commercial entities. So just the one tidbit in your story about how local Iowa companies could not advertise, but out-of-state companies could, which if it wasn't for the folks with Tone, the spice company, who complained and said, well, we have just as much of a right to advertise on this station. I mean, never mind the fact that it's an Iowa station. Of course, we should be able to, as our national competitors. Were that not the case, who knows what would have happened to the station, how it would have survived financially. That, to me, was one of the most interesting things about your story, was that transition from the educational aspect to not only competing in the commercial world, but then how legislation had to be changed for that to happen. I did not know that story until you wrote it for us. And
the story, in theory, is that they had a non-commercial educational radio station. And when they put in the application for TV, they figured that's what they would be given. And the FCC gave them a commercial frequency. And it's like, well, what do we do with this? And that's what led to the uniqueness over the course of time. So it is noted on the cover, WOI-TV in Des Moines, 75th anniversary coming up next month in February as the second station to go on the air in Iowa. Thank you for allowing me to share that story on the pages of Iowa History Journal. In addition, you'll learn about Simon Roberts, the first black wrestler to win both state and NCAA titles. And that's the first black to win in Iowa and the first black to win at the NCAA level. The way I phrased it may have sounded like you had to have both. He was the trailblazer in both categories and other fine things as well. It's Iowa History Journal, iowahistoryjournal.com. There's just no end of stories about our great state.
There are not. And, touching, circling back real quick to the story about WOI TV.
Sure.
I'm so glad that you included our mutual friend, Lou Seipel Jr., in the story, because folks from the central Iowa area know that name, not only for the work he's done over the years on Iowa Live on WOI TV, but his work in radio before that, too. And obviously, you and I are both fortunate enough to be an occasional guest on his show to talk about Iowa history. And kudos to Lou and the crew there at Iowa Live, because they're one of the few television entities, certainly here in central Iowa, who really care about Iowa history. And I love the fact that they're willing to have us on to come on and talk about it. And especially when you have the opportunity to come on and share things from your Iowa Almanac segments, I think it's just wonderful. And so hats off to those guys for helping keep Iowa History Journal alive.
Well, and it harkens back to those Iowa History Live and Iowa History Journal. You'll be...
that was a slip. My apologies. Yeah.
Well, if you don't say it, who will? But it does then harken back to the educational mission, the original educational mission of the station, still carried forth today. Mr. Swanger, it is always a pleasure. Thanks so much for talking today, but thanks even more for putting this fine magazine out 6 times a year. We'll talk in early March, if not before.
Looking forward to it. Thank you, Jeff.
Michael Swanger, Iowa History Journal, iowahistoryjournal.com. And he connected with us via Zoom yesterday, so you could hear the conversation now on a Wednesday on News Talk 1540 KXEL, where Iowa comes to talk.